When Oglala Tribal Chair Dick Wilson ran for re-election in early 1974, 12 people ran against him. So in the initial round of voting, the person who got the most votes was Russell Means, who was running for tribal chair. He was still in the process of trial and whatnot. So Russell Means came in first, and Dick Wilson came in second, followed by everybody else. So they had to have a runoff, and in the runoff, Wilson won. The U.S. Election Commission investigated and found all kinds of indications of fraud and vote tampering, but the federal court upheld the election, and so Dick Wilson stayed in office for 2 more years and really cracked down with his goons. In fact, in the 3 years following Wounded Knee, so that's the final year of Wilson's administration at that time, and then the next 2 years, about 50 political opponents of Dick Wilson were killed at Pine Ridge. On June 26, 1975, two FBI agents were at the Pine Ridge Reservation, Ronald Williams and Jack Kohler. They were they were looking for a Lakota man named Jimmy Eagle for questioning for possible robbery, and they saw a vehicle that matched his vehicle's description, a red truck, and followed it onto the Jumping Bull Ranch compound. And around noon, they radioed in that they had come under heavy fire from the occupants of the vehicle and they needed help immediately. An FBI agent named Gary Adams responded, but he too came under fire and he wasn't able to get very close to where they were. Williams and Kohler were both wounded multiple times and were found, each of them. They were in two separate cars, by the way, two separate unmarked cars. They were found outside their cars with bullet wounds to the head from close range. So they had been finished off. Altogether, between the two of them, the FBI agents had gotten off 5 shots, and approximately 125 bullets were found to have been fired into their cars, 114 of them from an AR-15. The FBI suspected 3 AIM members who had been seen near the ranch. Leonard Peltier, who is Ojibwe, his cousin Bob Robideau, also Ojibwe. Both of them had some Lakota heritage as well. And Dino Butler from the Siletz Reservation in Oregon. Robideau and Butler were apprehended fairly quickly. Peltier, however, slipped through their fingers and became the object of a national manhunt, making it onto the FBI's 10 most wanted list. They almost caught him in Oregon, but he slipped away again and made it to Canada. However, he was extradited from Canada to the United States, and the Canadian authorities claimed afterwards, and this has since been verified, that it was on the basis of falsified statements from the FBI that they agreed to extradite him. Meanwhile, Robideau and Butler stood trial together, having been apprehended earlier, and they were both acquitted by reason of self-defense, argument being that the FBI had fired on them, so they fired back. Peltier, being captured separately and later, was tried separately in Fargo, North Dakota. And whereas the first trial ended in an acquittal, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Now, if he had been apprehended at the same time as the other 2 and they had all been tried together, it's reasonable to assume that he also would have been acquitted. A lot of people believed that he was, well, that was his tough luck, because essentially the first 2 having slipped through the legal system from the perspective of the federal government, they definitely wanted to make it stick with somebody. Now, there were a lot of charges of inconsistencies in the government's case, and a lot of charges of, well, not just inconsistency, but falsified statements, which has been verified. Anyhow, this led to a move almost immediately of a lot of people around the country and around the world calling for Peltier to be freed, on the basis that really he was a political prisoner, that he was sort of a fall guy who was essentially, from that perspective, set up and given this draconian sentence because someone had to pay. There have been inconsistencies all the way around. A lot of different versions of the story. Peltier at one point, well, he initially said he wasn't in the area. Later, he admitted to having fired some of the shots, but not having gone up and finished off the 2 agents. Regardless, he is considered by many, like I said, a political prisoner. Amnesty International has been trying to get clemency for him for a long time, and he's still in prison as of this recording in 2020, and has been for 44 years. He escaped briefly in 1979 and was quickly recaught, and that added 5 years to his 2 life sentences. Anyway, he's a very elderly man now, and he's in very poor health. And people continue to seek clemency for him and his release. At this point, it doesn't seem very likely. By the way, if you don't know who the guy on the right is, well, that just makes me sad. That is, of course, John Lennon, formerly of the Beatles. While we're still in 1975, we have to talk about Anna Mae Aquash, who was born Anna Mae Pictou. She was Micmac, originally from Canada, but as a teenager her family had moved to Boston. She became associated with the American Indian movement not long after it started, and she was there at the occupation of the Mayflower. She was part of that trail of broken treaties and the occupation of the BIA building, and she also was at the siege, the occupation of Wounded Knee. In fact, when she first got there, Dennis Banks told her that they needed help in the kitchen, and she said, "I didn't come to wash dishes, I came to fight." While she was at Wounded Knee during the occupation, she was married to an Ojibwe activist that she had first met, I think, at the Mayflower incident, named Nagishik Aquash. And then she kept that name even though she and her husband weren't together for very long. They separated. And in 1974 she began a romantic relationship with Dennis Banks, who was in a long-term relationship with an Oglala woman named Kamuk Nichols. In fact, their relationship lasted 17 years, Banks and Nichols, and she's the mother of his children. Nonetheless, it seems that the two women got along well, even though this was all happening at the same time. Anyway, this ties into Leonard Peltier. During that time period, when he was on the most wanted list, part of that time, he was traveling toward the Northwest with several AIM members, including Dennis Banks and Kamuk Nichols and Anna Aquash. And they were traveling in an RV. And according to Kamuk Nichols' later testimony, Anna told her that Peltier had confessed to the shooting of the FBI agents. Anyway, over the course of that summer, that fall of 1975, on several occasions, she was detained. She was arrested a couple of times on weapons charges and other things, and very quickly released, which led some AIM members to suspect that she was an informant. Now, as to whether she was or not, we don't really know. We do know that it was common practice of COINTELPRO, the counter intelligence program of the FBI, whose focus was radical groups. It was common practice of them to have undercover agents, to be agents provocateurs, and frequently they would sow dissension in the ranks by accusing other people of being secret FBI agents. There's known instances of that happening among the Black Panthers. So it's possible on the one hand that they may have gotten to her and that she may have been an informant, that they may have been looking for information on Peltier. It's also possible that these suspicions were aroused by people who were working for the FBI. Anyway, in December 1975, Anna was in Denver, and she was on her way back to the Pine Ridge Reservation. She had continued working with the elders there, and she got a ride from two men, two AIM members, Arlo Looking Cloud, who was Oglala Lakota from Pine Ridge, and a man named John Graham, who was from a Canadian Athabascan tribe. So those two men and Graham's elderly aunt, who was in a nursing home not long after that. So anyway, they gave her a ride to Pine Ridge, and then no one ever saw her again until almost 2 weeks later, when her body was found out in the wilds outside of the reservation, or on the reservation property outside of any of the settlements. So for a long time, this was a big mystery. We did know that there were rumors that she was an FBI informant, and there was speculation that she may have been killed as a result of that. Remember Ray Robinson? The same thing happened. That may have been played a role in his death, possibly. However, many years later, 2004 was when the first trial was held. Arlo Looking Glass and John Graham were arrested and charged as a result of witnesses coming forward, including Kamuk Nichols, who testified in court about Peltier's alleged statement to Aquash. Also testifying against Arlo Looking Glass, or Looking Cloud rather, Arlo Looking Cloud, was John Trudell, former chair of the American Indian Movement, who said that Looking Cloud had confessed to him that he had killed Anna Mae Aquash. There was also a a woman involved, an Ogallala woman who was, her name was Thelma Conroy Rios. I'm sorry, I had to look at my notes there. The allegation was that she had helped with the kidnapping. So charges were leveled, accusations were made in these trials by Rios and others that they had heard that the order had come from higher up in the organization that Anna Mae Aquash had to be executed. And apparently what had happened was they took her to Pine Ridge. They took her to the home of another AIM member named Vine Richard Marshall, who was charged with having provided the murder weapon. She was shot in the back of the head, but he was acquitted. But at some point, she was raped, and then the two men took her out to an isolated part of the reservation and shot her in the back of the head and left her there. It took a very long time. Obviously, it was 30 plus years before anyone was brought to justice and any semblance of a story of what happened was revealed. In the course of the trial, the prosecutors also alleged, although they did not charge, the lawyer of Leonard Peltier for also having been a co-conspirator in this. So, sad story of Anna Mae Aquash. The last major initiative that came from the American Indian movement, and really the last major initiative of the Red Power movement writ large, came in 1978, and it was called The Longest Walk. It was inspired by the fact that 11 bills were being presented in Congress that would limit even further Native American land rights and water rights in particular. Most of these were being presented by congressmen from Washington State. And Washington State had a lot of issues with Native people, actually throughout much of the 20th century, particularly when it came to fishing rights. So anyway, these bills were about to be presented to Congress and to protest the damage that such bills would do to Native sovereignty if they were passed. It was decided that something really big needed to be done. Now, a lot of Native organizations and a lot of tribes got involved in this event, but it was organized by the American Indian movement. Essentially what it was is just what it sounds like, a walk across the country. Unlike the Trail of Broken Treaties from a few years before that, which had been a drive across the country. So the walk started in Alcatraz in February 1978, and it started with a sacred ceremony. And then people started walking eastward, joined as they went by more and more people, and continuing to have spiritual and religious activities as a large part of the focus of the event. By the time they reached Washington, D.C. in July, there were about 2,000 people. Roughly 24 of that 2,000 had started in Alcatraz, and all the others had joined along the way. And once they got there, they went to the Washington Monument and spent about a week protesting and giving speeches and being supported by a lot of charitable organizations and even churches locally. It was a different kind of event from the things that AIM had done in previous years. It was a softer approach, really. a softer approach and in some ways a more inclusive approach, as not just people who were hardcore committed activists, but just a lot of regular folks from the various tribes joined in on this, and a lot of allies as well along the way. Now, the bills they were protesting did not get passed. In fact, Washington State at this time was kind of an outlier, as we will see in a moment. But anyway, this was a very impactful event. It was a very, very peaceful event. And it marked a major transition in approaches and in goals, because sovereignty, native sovereignty, was being emphasized and entering the vocabulary not just of activists, but again of just average tribal members, many of whom had not thought that much maybe about it before. Also, the concept of the 7 generations. Maybe you've heard that. It started being talked about a lot during this march. The fact that indigenous people always think 7 generations ahead when they do something as to how it's going to affect all the way down to the 7th generation. Now, in a lot of ways, this event was kind of a forerunner of things that would happen later, more recently, in the 21st century, such as the protests of the Keystone Pipeline and the protests of the pipeline at Standing Rock. You can really see a lot of the antecedents for the approaches that were taken then in this event. By the way, the longest walk was reenacted 30 years later in 2008 in The Longest Walk 2, and it has been done a couple of times since then as well, with the same kind of overall goals, not the same specific bills from 1978, but the idea of the protection of sovereignty and indigenous lands and water rights more recently in particular. Now, in the intervening years between 1978 and 2008, the American Indian movement was fairly dormant. It still existed in various iterations. A lot of histories will tell you that it disbanded in 1978, and for all intents and purposes, it practically did, although, like I said, it continues to exist today and to be one of many organizations that promote sovereignty, native sovereignty, and indigenous rights. So essentially, the large role that the American Indian movement played, the central and pivotal role in many ways, subsided with the end of the Red Power era. But what does that mean? What does it mean that the Red Power era ended? There were no longer these big, dramatic, publicity-seeking events like the occupation of government buildings and gunfire being exchanged and things like that. It was a different kind of approach after 1978. That it was the longest walk approach. And why did that change? I would argue, and so would many other people, I think, that the reason the tactics changed and became less dramatic and confrontational is because those tactics had worked. They had worked very well and had achieved their purpose and were no longer necessary. What was their purpose? Their purpose was to get the attention of the country, to get the attention of the the political leaders and of the average American citizenry, to make them aware of the issues Native people were facing, and also to get the attention of Native people and to inspire them to seek more self-empowerment, to seek more self-determination, to get more involved. And all those things were done. The fact that starting with Alcatraz and going up through the Wounded Knee occupation, that there was so much media coverage of the things that had happened that it not only made many Americans aware of the continued existence of indigenous people and of their problems, but also gained an enormous amount of public support for those indigenous people in trying to solve their problems. And this got translated into political action. In the mid to late 1970s, there were some enormous strides in the right direction so far as legislation regarding Native sovereignty, as well as enormous strides in making the American public aware and gaining the support of many members of the American public. In fact, within a few years after Wounded Knee, despite the fact that there had been so much violence, there was a growing feeling among many Americans that Dennis Banks and Russell Means and their compatriots were American heroes, and they began to be valorized, even romanticized, which is a long-standing and unfortunate American tradition. But in this case, it led to more public support. Is really the point that I'm making. And so therefore, the tactics and the strategies changed away from seizing buildings and having direct action confrontation to doing things in the courtrooms, to doing things in politics, to doing things through academia, as more and more of those radical Native people became members of academia. So in some ways, it's almost ironic, because the ultimate approach wound up being the approach of those, quote, Uncle Tomahawks that some of the young radicals criticized in the early to mid 60s. But I would argue that the very dramatic confrontations were necessary to get things to that level. And here are some of the major legislative accomplishments of the 1970s that pertain to Native people. Now, first of all, in 1970, Nixon had declared his intention to end the policy of termination. In 1973, it was officially ended completely, although, as we saw, there are still a lot of tribes that got terminated that still have not been able to reestablish their status. 1975 saw the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act. And what that did was it guaranteed more self-determination for tribes, gave tribes more control over the resources on their reservation, the environmental resources and the financial resources. And the educational assistance part, that gave them the ability to build schools that were tribally controlled, not necessarily dictated by the BIA. And unlike in the past, what that meant was if a tribe's going to build a school, they can take bids from contractors, take the money that is allocated them by the U.S. government, but decide as a tribe who's going to do the construction. as opposed to having it dictated to them. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act finally enabled Native Americans to practice their traditional ceremonies legally, many of which had not been able to be practiced openly and legally. AIM, by the way, once they chose Leonard Crow Dog as their spiritual guide, they started having sun dances. The first one, I think, was on the Rosebud Reservation in the early 1970s, but that was unsanctioned by the government. Now the government's not going to get involved in any of that stuff. 1978, the Tribally Controlled Community College Educational Assistance Act, which is just what it sounds like. The finances and, again, the self-determination to set up tribal community colleges. Also in 1978, and this is an important one, the American Indian Child Welfare Act, sometimes called ICWA for short, ICWA. That law requires that, well, for one thing, it forbids the taking away of Native American children from their parents to send them to boarding schools or to put them out for adoption, two things that had been done for, 80, 90 years at that point. Remember, even many of the AIM members had gone through this as kids. So under ICWA, essentially the rule is that if a Native American child is put up for adoption, then a member of that tribe is the preferred adopter. If anyone can be found in the tribe to adopt the child, that's the first thing that would be done. If there's not anyone, then someone who is at least Native American, officially enrolled Native American family, would then have the opportunity to adopt the child before, finally, if none of those could be found, which is very unlikely, then non-Indian families could adopt. The purpose of that is to prevent the forced assimilation of Native people by taking away their children and re-educating them in other cultures so that they no longer know their own culture. So all these very important acts that came about in the 1970s. The next thing that I'm going to do in the next section or two that will wrap things up is to look at some notable Plains tribes individuals from the post-Red Power era, and then take a look at the pipeline protests in the northern plains of the 21st century. But before I do that, remember how earlier in this course, when we were in the 1860s and 70s and there was so much fighting going on, I would put up essentially like roster cards so that you could get a clearer idea of who all was involved and what was going on. And it occurs to me, I should do something like that for the Red Power era. First off, I think that we should start with the women, and I think that the strong Native women that we've talked about deserve the focus and deserve their own spotlight. Now let's take a look at some of the men we've discussed who were prominent members of the American Indian movement. And finally, let's take a look at some of the guys who were not members of AIM, but were significant parts of the Red Power story in one way or another. Now, look at this. You might want to go back and take a look at the previous two slides and think about the fact that these are 25 individuals total that I've put on these three slides. 25. out of those 25, 23 are either from Plains tribes or from Plains adjacent tribes that traditionally had interaction with the Plains. 23 out of 25. And of the two who were not, Anna Aquash, who was Micmac from New England, Canada area, and Richard Oakes, who was Mohawk, who are from New York. Out of those two, the only two who were not somehow Plains oriented, one of them died on Pine Ridge Reservation. So I think that says a lot about the role that the Plains tribes played in the Red Power movement.